So I want you to imagine spending weeks just traveling across Europe, tracking down this very specific 1963 railway hat in an Uzbek flea market, writing a song in 3 different languages,
Ah,
only to realize you weren't actually doing any of this to make a piece of art.
right, which is wild to think about.
Yeah, exactly. You were doing it to basically build a working prototype of your own mind.
It completely inverts how we usually view, productivity and creativity.
Hmm.
Because we look at a timestamp on some massive document we finally finished, right? Or we remember the exact date we made a sudden life-altering decision.
Oh, totally. Like, I decided to quit my job on a Tuesday.
Exactly. And we tell ourselves that it just happened in a weekend, but that visible output is, it's rarely a sudden creation. It's more like a tectonic snap.
A tectonic snap. I like that.
Yeah, because the pressure has been grinding beneath the surface for months, and what we call creation is just the moment the Earth finally moves.
And that paradox, the illusion of fast creation hiding this very slow, quiet process of integration is exactly what we're getting into in our deep dive today.
And we have a really deeply unusual stack of sources for this one.
We do. So
Good.
we're looking at a collection of personal notes, a mapped timeline of a physical journey across Europe, and a multilingual song called Zwischen den Sich, which translates to Between Rails.
Between rails, yeah.
Right. And our mission here is to sort of trace how one person's highly specific experience of transition was transformed into a universal framework for self-understanding.
But to do that properly,
Yeah.
I mean, we really have to look past the surface level events. Because it's incredibly easy to look at any chaotic period in our lives and just casually label it a process.
No, people love doing that. Trust the process, right?
Right. But if we are going to extract an actual functional method from these sources, we have to understand the real mechanics, like what is actually happening in the brain and the psyche when we metabolize our own lives.
How does a random collection of memories actually crystallize into a new identity? Well, the sources don't start with some dense psychological theory to answer that. They
Yeah.
start with a physical anchor, a location in Luxembourg called Minett Park Fond-de-Gras.
And usually when you picture an old railway site or like an industrial park, you imagine this dead museum.
Yeah, something sanitized, frozen behind glass, entirely separated from the present day.
But the notes explicitly reject that idea. They describe Fond-de-Gras as the living geology of time.
Living geology, which is such a vital concept here because it fundamentally changes how we view obsolete systems.
Yeah, the notes focus heavily on the rust, the abandoned mining shafts, the heavy iron tracks, because these are traces of immense labor.
But the system didn't die. It just lost its original function.
Right. The infrastructure is still there. It's this physical manifestation of how human memory works. I mean, we don't delete our past selves or our old operating system.
No, we don't. They just become lower layers in our internal geology.
Exactly. And the issue isn't that the past disappears, it's that it stops being readable to us.
And that specific concept, readability, is what drives this really unusual, almost bizarre sequence of events in the notes. So there is this man named Vasily,
Right.
and he visits this park with his wife, Olga, and their daughter, Vasilisa. And they were just deeply moved by the space, particularly the volunteer-maintained steam trains.
And it really impacts them.
It does. So they decide they want to make a donation. But instead of just writing a check, which would be the normal thing to do, Vasily goes on this incredibly complex hunt for a meaningful object.
Because a financial transaction doesn't restore meaning to a system, right? A check is functional, but it lacks memory.
Oh, that's perfectly put. So Vasily taps into his Slavic roots, searching through all these antique networks. Because, the geopolitical shifts and emigrations of the last century, a lot of Western European artifacts ended up moving east over time.
Which is fascinating just on a historical level.
Totally. And Vasily's search eventually leads him to a literal flea market in Uzbekistan.
Of all places.
Right. And sitting there, mixed in with this totally random assortment of international railway gear, is a pristine 1963 Luxembourg National Railway kepi.
A worker's hat. But the physical details on it are what really matter here.
Yeah, break that down for us.
Well, the sources describe the insignias on this hat, the stars and oak leaf patterns. And these functioned as a visual language. They instantly communicated a worker's rank within the system.
Like a uniform code.
Exactly. And this specific hat had 2 rail motifs framing the logo, which signified that the person who wore it was responsible for track maintenance. So it wasn't just a hat, it was a piece of the infrastructure's vocabulary.
Wow. So Vasily buys the hat, leaves the original Cyrillic label attached to the custom-cut shoebox, and travels back to Luxembourg to present it to the park.
It's an incredible gesture.
It really is beautiful, objectively. But we have to ask, why is this specific story the foundational pillar of these personal notes?
I think it functions as the perfect external model for what the author is trying to do internally, because the sources explicitly state that this isn't about an object, it's about the transmission of meaning through time. Lily's journey wasn't about acquiring something new, it was a journey into the depth of time to retrieve a lost piece of vocabulary. So by returning that specific hat to that specific park, a forgotten layer of that living geology suddenly became readable again.
But retrieving the vocabulary is really only the first step, right? I mean, you can't just observe an old railway park, appreciate a nice story about a hat, and expect your whole psyche to restructure itself.
And it takes actual work.
Yeah. And the notes show that immediately after this realization at Fond-de-Gras, the author initiates this phase of deliberate physical displacement. They leave the anchor, they travel to Paris, and then eventually to the coast of Brittany.
And the environmental shift there is critical. The notes really emphasize these vivid sensory details, the salt in the air, the violent wind coming off the Atlantic, and this literal whisper in the night saying, quote, bon voyage.
Which feels so cinematic.
It does. But biologically, when you want to disrupt entrenched neural pathways, you really have to overload the system with novel sensory input. You basically have to step outside of the environment where your current identity was formed.
So they stay in that state of displacement for months. But they don't stay gone forever, because the cycle demands a return.
Right. They eventually go back to Fond-de-Gras.
They do, but their behavior completely changes. They aren't just observing the old tracks anymore. The return involves a photo shoot.
Yes.
They bring a young girl, Vasilisa, place her among the 1900s first and second class train wagons, and have her wear these vintage dresses.
See, they are actively inserting themselves into the landscape now. It's no longer passive observation. By dressing in the vintage clothing and, documenting it within the old infrastructure, they are physically embodying the past to close the loop.
They are writing themselves into that geology.
Exactly.
But hold on. I'm looking at this timeline, and I really have to ask the obvious question here. I'm sure listeners are thinking it too.
Go for it.
This sounds exactly like a standard artist retreat. You go to a historical park, you take a trip to Paris, you get inspired by the wind in Brittany, you come home and do a cool creative photo shoot.
Yeah.
Why are the notes treating this sequence of events like some sort of profound psychological breakthrough?
That's the perfect question. And it's because of what happens immediately after the loop closes. The creative output isn't the point. The output is actually a diagnostic tool.
You mean the song?
Yes. The notes detail that within one single week of this return, a complete song emerges, zwischen den sich between rails.
Right.
But the structure of the song is what separates this from basic, artistic inspiration. It uses an architectural approach to language.
The three languages.
Yes.
The intro and the bridge are in Luxembourgish, the verses are in French, and the chorus and the structural framework are in English.
Right. And we have to understand those aren't just aesthetic choices. They are load-bearing tillers for different psychological states.
Okay, break that down. How so?
Well, Luxembourgish represents the physical anchor, right? The grounding reality of the railway itself. French carries the limbic response, the emotion, the wind, the whole feeling of displacement.
And the English?
English operates more like the prefrontal cortex. It provides the objective structure, the universal realization of what the entire experience actually meant.
Oh, wow. But the author makes a very aggressive clarification in the notes about this. They write, quote, "Music is not a product. It is a tool of integration."
Yeah.
They state very clearly that this song was not written in a week. That 7-day period was just the tectonic snap we talked about earlier. They were, quote, assembling themselves into an audible form.
And just think about the neurological implication of that exact phrase.
Yeah.
Assembling yourself into an audible form implies that prior to the song, the self was fragmented.
Just floating pieces.
Right. All that unintegrated data, the rust at Fond-de-Gras, the salt in Brittany, the historical weight of Vasily's kepi, it was all just floating in the subconscious.
So the act of writing the song wasn't about expressing an emotion they already understood.
Not at all. The creation of the song was the mechanism the brain used to finally comprehend what had happened.
That honestly shifts the entire paradigm of why we create things. I mean, they didn't write a song to tell a story about the past. They built a song to make their present self readable.
Exactly.
And this brings us to the actual framework we can extract from these sources. The notes call this process identity prototyping.
Which is such a brilliant theft of engineering terminology, honestly, just applied directly to the human psyche.
It really is. Let's define it using the core statement from the text. They say, I don't just create, I prototype identity until it becomes real.
Right. Because in product design, a prototype is a low-risk model. You build it to test how a concept behaves in the physical world before you commit to basically manufacturing the whole thing.
And the sources suggest we do the exact same thing with our identities.
We have to, because fully stepping into a new version of yourself is psychologically terrifying. It requires abandoning the safety of your current living geology.
Yeah, no one wants to just leap into the void.
Exactly. So instead of leaping blindly, we project a piece of our future self out into the world. We write a highly opinionated essay, or we draft a really risky proposal at work, or we paint something entirely out of our usual style.
We are testing the waters.
We want to see how this new identity sounds, how it feels, and most importantly, how we react when we observe it externally.
To actually execute this, the notes map out a 5-phase cycle. And this is where the mechanics really become visible and practical.
Yeah, let's walk through them.
So phase 1 is silence.
Which is deeply counterintuitive, because in the silence phase, it feels like absolutely nothing is happening.
Right. It just feels like stagnation.
But neurologically, this is an accumulation period. Your brain's reticular activating system, which is the filter that decides what information reaches your conscious mind, it starts highlighting very specific signals.
And the notes give specific examples of these signals. Like, the author kept seeing the timestamp 1.43. They kept noticing this motif of a black rabbit, which they eventually interpreted as a guide, pulling them into the unknown.
Now, to the outside world, that just sounds like magical thinking.
Yeah, a big woo-woo.
Exactly. But mechanically, it's just the brain priming itself. The subconscious recognizes that a shift is necessary, so it starts flagging data points in your environment. You are in a state of high sensitivity but zero clarity.
And that sensitivity eventually triggers phase 2, which is resonance. You don't have the full picture yet, but your limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, starts reacting.
Right. You see an old railway hat in Uzbekistan, or you stand in a rusted industrial park, and you just feel this profound tug.
You recognize a connection without possessing the vocabulary to explain it yet.
And you can't stay in that state of unexplained resonance forever, right? The friction forces you into phase 3. Movement.
The literal trip to Paris and Brittany.
Or it could be a metaphorical one, because movement is the transition state. You have detached from the old stability, but you haven't arrived at the new one yet.
This is the space the song calls between the rails.
Yeah. It is a period of intense psychological tension. You are suspended in the total ambiguity of transition.
Which perfectly explains why phase 4 feels so sudden. Because phase 4 is manifestation.
Yes.
The tension of the in-between state finally demands a release. The tectonic plates snap. The presentation is written in a 12-hour frenzy. The multilingual song emerges in a week.
It feels fast, but the form is simply catching up to the months of silent pressure.
If this were a conventional model of creativity, the process would just stop right there. You manifested the object, you hit publish, you take your bow.
Right, on to the next thing.
But identity prototyping requires the 5th and most crucial phase, which is integration.
The return to Fond-de-Gras.
Exactly. You have to take the prototype back to the anchor point. But you aren't the same person who left. The cycle closes not when the song is finished, but when the creator is fundamentally transformed by having written it.
And this is where we have to be incredibly honest with ourselves, because we live in an era where we are constantly manifesting outputs. We are endlessly generating text, images, and opinions online.
Oh, constantly.
So if we are using our creations to prototype who we are becoming, how do we distinguish between an output that actually alters our internal geology and an output that is just an act?
The notes anticipate that exact problem, and they provide a defining rule that acts as a diagnostic test for the entire framework. They say, integration changes you, performance displays you.
We really need to unpack the friction between those two words, display versus change.
Yeah.
Performance is when you use an output to manage how the world perceives you. You are trying to control the narrative. But integration is when the output manages you. It reveals something to you that forces your internal baseline to shift.
I want to apply this directly to you, listening to this deep dive right now. Think about the last significant thing you put out into the world.
Anything, really.
Yeah. Maybe you drafted a very vulnerable, highly visible email to your entire team. Maybe you launched a side project on social media. Or maybe you spent a weekend building a new piece of art. When you hit send or publish or complete work, Why did you actually do it?
There is a practical way to measure this derived from the framework. We can call it the 72-hour test.
I love this part.
Right.
Okay.
So look at the prototype you just manifested. Wait 72 hours, let the initial dopamine spike of hitting publish completely fade, then check your internal baseline.
And what are we looking for?
If nothing inside you has fundamentally shifted, if your daily choices, your perception of your own capabilities, and your emotional resting state remain exactly as they were before you made the thing, then it was likely just performance.
You displayed a costume for an audience. But if that creation alters how you read your own life,
Yeah.
if making that object or sending that message provides a new physical anchor in your reality, and you find yourself actually making different decisions because of it, then you didn't just perform.
No. You successfully integrated a new identity, the prototype worked, and you are now manufacturing the final product. But it requires a willingness to let the form lead you. You have to surrender the desire to perfectly control your image. You have to allow the song or the project or the decision to actually teach you what you believe.
So mapping this onto your own timeline right now, where are you in the cycle? Where's the living geology of your current reality? Or are you stuck in the silence phase?
Which is tough.
It is. It might feel incredibly frustrating, like absolutely nothing is moving forward. But if you stop looking for the massive tectonic snap and start looking for the quiet signals, the repeating numbers, the random motifs pulling at your attention, you might realize your brain is already gathering the materials for your next prototype.
Or maybe you are deep in the movement phase. You feel destabilized. The old ways of operating feel hollow, but the new structure hasn't materialized yet. You are feeling the violent wind of transition, and it's exhausting because you just lack a map.
The ultimate lesson from Vareli's Kepi, the vintage dresses at the railway, and the architectural structure of Zwischen den Tisch, is that the discomfort of that movement isn't a sign that you are lost.
Not at all.
The journey is never about running away to become a completely different person. It is simply the process of walking through the messy, unintegrated data of your own past until you finally become readable to yourself.
We are conditioned to obsess over the destination, We want the finished product, a clean diagnosis, the impressive title we can put on a resume.
Always looking for the endpoint.
Right. We view the time spent in between as wasted time. But identity prototyping proves that the magic, the actual neurological restructuring, happens entirely in the delay. The invisible months of pressure are the actual work. The week of creation is just the receipt.
As we close out this deep dive, I really want you to consider a final thought, drawn straight from the fading outro of that multilingual song. The lyrics at the very end of Between Rails strip away all the languages until there is just a quiet realization.
Yeah.
We burn so much energy trying to secure solid names, fixed titles, and permanent places for ourselves. We desperately want to arrive.
But what if your true identity isn't a fixed destination at all? I mean, consider who you are when you are between the rails. Stripped of the title, stripped of the old stability, not yet arrived at the new one.
Who are you then?
Who are you when you are just a form that remains, quietly becoming, long before the world ever gets to hear you?
It completely dismantles how we judge our own progress. So the next time you create something in a frenzy and wonder where it came from, or the next time you feel stuck in the silent friction of transition, remember this. You aren't waiting for inspiration. You are building the prototype. You're just waiting for the exact moment the pressure demands to become audible.